What's up, everyone? Jacob Roach back here from the Killing Joke Studios and Mixing with Metal. Thanks so much for tuning in, guys. I've seen that people have been checking out the videos and that people have been subscribing to the channel, and that's really amazing. That makes me really happy and excited. I'm trying to work on a lot of things right now to make sure that I can share as much as I possibly know about audio in general, and especially audio with metal. So today we're going to be talking about a very crucial aspect of any metal mix, and that is a solid bass tone. Bass is one of those things that's just, it's often pushed aside and it's not thought about, but it is so important in metal, and getting an aggressive bass tone has become really popular maybe in the past 6 or 7 years in metal. It's really a crunchy, distorted bass tone is really kind of at the forefront of a good metal mix now, and I'm going to show you my process for doing that. Now, there is a lot of different ways to get an aggressive bass tone, so please do not take this as the only way. I've tried splitting my bass tracks. I've tried doing all sorts of stuff. This is just what works for me, and this is what gets me the results I want, so that's what I use. So to start off, I just have a bass DI here. Now, this is just Zombass 2, I think. So we programmed this bass, and I think this is Zombass 2. And yeah, so it's just program bass, but it is a program bass DI. So if you have a bass DI, you should be good. That's well recorded and everything. DI signal for bass is really important. That's why I opt to just programming a lot of times, and then you have to worry about tuning your bass and all that sort of stuff, tuning it later with Melodyne, which I'm actually going to be uploading a video on in a couple weeks here, so make sure you stay tuned for that. But generally I just program it because I know this DI works, I know how to work with it, and I've got my tone dialed in for it already, so I don't have to really think about it. I just program it, and my bass sound's already there. So once I've committed the bass MIDI and I have it as an audio file in Pro Tools, the first thing I do is I try and add some color to it. So as you can see here, I have the virtual mix rack loaded up, and I also have the Omega End from Kush loaded up. Now, I use either of these plugins just to add a little bit of color to the bass signal before going in. Now, I don't always do this, but sometimes it can be good to, just add a little bit more to the signal. So I'm going to just go back and forth between these two and pick which one I like. So I think I'm going to settle on this Omega preamp from Kush because it's adding a lot of those Neve low mids, and it's rounding out the bass tone in a cool way. And I think once we hit the bus processing, it'll work out pretty nicely. Now, I don't exactly know why I process all on the bus. It's not for any particular reason. I guess if I were to split the bass tracks, I would process on the bus, but I just got in the habit of bus processing like this. You could do all of this on the track, but I opt to just do it on the bus, especially since there's a lot of plugins, and I like, if I can, to leave space in between certain plugins in case I want to add anything in later. So now we got our bass tone ready to go. It's going to hit the bus, and it's going to hit all of our processing. We got run through the Omega End, and so let's dive into it. The first thing I have on the bus is Fabfilter Saturn. And Saturn is a really awesome distortion plugin. It's a multi-band distortion plugin, and this is kind of simulating what you would do by distorting the different bass tracks. So splitting the bass up and distorting, the top end and then leaving the low end. This is kind of doing that, but it does it in a way that I think is really pleasing, and you don't have to worry about phase, which is what I run into a lot when splitting bass tracks. I have phase issues, and I just don't want to deal with it. So Saturn works really well for me. So what I have going on here is I have 3 different bands. I have a low band, which is set to clean tape. It doesn't really matter. I'm trying for nothing to happen on the low band, so I could even turn it off. Not really trying to do anything here. I have a mid-range frequency, which is heavy saturation. You could use some other settings. This is typically what sounds nice for me, and I drive that really hard. And this is the meat of the aggression of the bass tone, is in this mid to high mid area. And then on the top end, sometimes I'll slide this up, but generally I just leave the top end untouched and I drive it just a little with some tape saturation. And that just adds a little bit more sparkle to the top end, which sounds pretty nice to me. So let me just show you really quick what this is doing. And what I'm trying to do here is, you can see the frequency analyzer it shows you where the low end's really bumping. And so I slide this until I'm not getting a whole lot of lows in there. So let me kind of show you what that sounds like when you get those in there. The bass tone kind of falls apart. So I try and let all the lows pass through unaffected, distort the mid-range, and then just add a little bit of tape saturation to the top. So that's Saturn. That's really cool. Now we move on to our next piece in the chain, which is super important, and that is an impulse response of some sort. So I have just Waves IR1 here, and let's see. It's already loaded up. But you can see here, it's a Ampeg 8x10 with a D6 on it, and that's typically what I use. Make sure if you're using IR1 that you don't have the early reflections or the tail on, you just have the direct input on and mix 100%. And so I just, it was a free impulse response pack of an Ampeg 810 I found online, and I just like this D6, and so that's what I use, and that's what's on my chain, and nothing else is going on there. So let me show you what difference that makes. All right, now that's starting to sound like a bass tone coming out of an amp. So that would be our amp section. We have Saturn running into a cabinet, and that's our bass amp. And so now we can continue on doing the actual processing of the chain. So the first thing immediately after is I have an EQ. Okay. And this is, if anything changes a whole lot in this chain, it's this EQ. So let me just bypass it and bring it in, show you what it's doing, then I'll talk about it a little bit. Cool. So what you're hearing, and what's really interesting about this, is that I have a lot of lows rolled off, but the bass sounds fuller. There sounds like there's more low end, even though I'm filtering out up to about 50 or 60 hertz here. The big reason for that is this cut right here, around 500 hertz. So generally I'll find something in the mid-range that's kind of nasty, and I'll pull quite a bit of it out. So let me show you what difference just this cut makes. So I'm cutting immediately above the low end. And the reason that I'm doing that is because it's getting rid of some mud that I don't really need in the bass track. I don't need a whole lot of 500 in the bass track. And what that's doing is effectively putting more emphasis on the low end. So again, that principle of cutting and not boosting, and we're emphasizing the low end without having to turn up a ton of it. I also have a 0.5 dB boost here. I probably just threw that on there just because it's not really doing a whole lot. Very, very little low end enhancement, just a little bit of reinforcement. Other than that, I have a notch here at, let's see, 3K. Just some resonance in the cabinet that's not pleasant. And then I have, of course, the elephant in the room, the filter. And then I have a little bit of cut here, which I think I probably just threw on, maybe just to change the filter shape a little bit. But what this filter is doing is allowing the kick drum low end to come through here. So I have this EQ set up so that the bass is sitting above the kick drum frequency wise, so that the kick drum low end and the bass low end aren't fighting. So by moving that up and then cutting above the lows, the bass still sounds full, but we're allowing the kick drum to breathe here and giving it room to punch through in this sub region. And so that's why I have it filtered all the way up there. Nothing crazy going on here. And what's really cool is that this EQ, just doing these few things, is super effective. This is just as a case-by-case basis, but this move here does a ton for the bass tone. So the EQ is really important, and I generally EQ right after. Next, we run into trusty old Slate virtual mix rack, okay? And we got a lot going on here. So I have the modern blue 1176. I have the custom series lift parallel thing, and then I have a Neve EQ. So let me bypass that, bring it in, and then we'll talk about each of the modules. So yeah, that does a whole lot going on there. And at first it's kind of shocking. Let me bring down my limiter a little bit because I don't want to destroy your guys' ears. And that does a whole lot right there. So obviously we're getting a big volume boost going on, and that's okay. I'm not too concerned about that. What I'm trying to do here is a few things. So, excuse me. First thing, the compressor. So this is a bass DI, and we want to compress it because we want to even out the playing. We want to make it sound like the playing is super consistent. Even though it's programmed, some compression doesn't hurt. So let me show you what that compression's doing on its own. It's adding some movement. It's adding some life. It's, you know, it's taking this dull bass DI and bringing a little bit more sway to it. I have the high pass filter engaged because I don't want all those lows that are passing through Saturn to trigger it. Looking to get no more than maybe 5 dB just on this bass. Depending, if you're recording a live bass, you're going to go for a lot more compression. But since this is a program bass and theoretically played super consistently, I don't need any more than 5. I have my release set to super fast because I want to, you know, just come immediately off. I don't want the bass to sound pumpy. I want the compression to go immediately off. And then I have my attack set just shy of completely fast, just so I can let a little bit of the pick attack through, so the bass still doesn't sound choked. So like if I brought this all the way up, let me show you what that does. So it gives it just a little bit more space to allow that pick attack through. Next thing is this lift. So let me bring that in, show you what that's doing. So this is doing a whole lot. So I like this lift, and the reason I like it is when I'm EQing bass, I typically go a little crazy, and that can be a big problem. So the reason I like this lift so much is because I just have 2 knobs and I have some buttons, and I can just go in and that's what I need for bass. I'm not looking for a bunch of mid-range stuff, which mid-range stuff is going on with the Neve, and we'll get to that in a minute, but I want to add some top and I want to add some lows. And so I'm boosting a ton of top because by nature, a 812 with a D6 might be a little dark. And then I'm boosting quite a bit of lows. And then I just switch back and forth between these two. This is something I change often in the chain, just whether I want it to be silky or present, just depending on the song, depending if I actually recorded bass, if I'm using the DI, whatever. And so I just dial this into taste. 2 knobs, easy to do. Next thing is this FGN, which is the Neve EQ. I'm doing a few things here. I'm filtering again, which I don't really know why I filtered again. This is something that I just set up and it's good to go. So filtering to 50 hertz, even though I already filtered, probably just to tame. Oh yeah, that's probably why. Just to tame all this low end bump, probably to get rid of some of that. That's why I filtered again. Because we filtered here, but we need to filter here as well to tame this. And I guess we could put that after, but that's a whole nother thing. So what's going on here is I'm driving the Neve a little bit, or driving the Neve a lot actually, getting a little bit more color in there, and then I'm doing a lot on these 3 bands. So I'm boosting a ton of top. I'm boosting some 3.2, just a little bit, just to give it a little bit of cut. Bring that back up. Give it a little bit of cut, and then I'm boosting 750, just to give give the bass a little bit more blend with the guitars. So let me show you what that's doing. So that EQ does a lot. This is a very, very, very aggressive EQ. And so when you boost top, it's kind of dangerous. And typically I don't use this to boost top. I'll use something else. But this works for the bass tone, and I like how it sounds. So that's VMR, and that's doing a ton of heavy lifting. Just one more time, bypass and then brought in. Cool, doing a lot. Next plugin, another instance of Pro Q2. And all I'm doing here is just filtering out some top. So let me show you what that's doing. So I'm getting all this aggression from here, and it sticks out like a sore thumb then, and then I filter. And the reason I'm doing that is because I'm trying to get this aggression and kind of give this perceived top end without it actually being too much. So for instance, like with the guitar amp, you might boost a ton of lows and then filter it out, but you're creating harmonics, and that gives this perceived low end, even though you may be filtering out a lot of low end. Doing the same thing with the bass on the top end. So I'm boosting a lot of top and then filtering it out, giving it a different shape to the filter. If we added all of these EQs up and saw the shape, it'd probably be something kind of crazy. And it's doing, it just does something I like for it. So I filter the top end just because I don't want it to stick out above the guitars, and it just doesn't need to. It needs to sit right below the guitars. So next plugin, max bass. Max bass is super important for this bass chain. Really because this bass DI doesn't have a whole lot of low end in it. Zombass 2 doesn't have a whole lot of low end. So max bass is really important for dialing in that low end. So I'll bring that in. It's creating those bass harmonics and giving a lot more perceived low end bump to the bass, and that helps out a lot, especially considering we're filtering out. It gives us a perceived big bass tone, and we can bring this up or bring this down, but max bass is super important. All right, we're nearing the end. We have good old trusty Pro MB here. So I'm doing 2 things on Fabfilter's Pro MB. I'm taming the low end, and I'm taming some of the pick attack. So I'll bypass that, and then let me show you what's doing. Cool. So on the low end side of things, I have a pretty slow attack and a pretty fast release. I want the low end to punch through, and I want it to take a while to rest. I'm trying to give it, some movement, but keep it as tamed as I possibly can. So I really dial these in and kind of watch this line here and try and make sure this line, whenever the low end is hitting, that it's resting at 0 dB. So I boost this output up just so that it's sitting kind of at this line. So if we check that out, we can kind of see what that line's doing. Cool. And so that's what I do for the bass low end. And then up here, there's a lot of pick attack, and it's kind of gross sounding. Let me turn that off and bring it in. Really using that more as tone shaping. And I probably just reach for this instead of reaching for another EQ, and that's what turned out. And again, this is what's preset in my bass chain, and it's just what works for me. Next, we have just Pro G, the gate, and don't always need this, but because I'll come in here and typically cut this out if I have noise, but this just gives me if the bass track is playing, just gives me some a noise gate so that not all that nastiness is coming through since we're distorting it. Let me show you that's doing. In this case, it's actually taking quite a bit away from the signal, and we don't really need it because it's not, all that distortion's not coming through. And so we're all good. And if the distortion was coming through, I'd typically just go in and chop it out. But in this case, it's fine. I just have it loaded up in my template just in case I do need it for anything. And if I reamp the bass through Sans Amp or something like that. So that's it. That's my bass chain. So let's go from nothing all the way to finished product and just show you the difference. And boom, you got that crunchy bass tone going on. So this is how I process bass. Again, there's a lot of different ways to process bass, splitting the tracks and all sorts of stuff, but this is what works for me. So make sure you try it out in your mixes and let me know what you think in the comments below. Once again, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure you click that button in the center of the screen to subscribe to the channel and check out the 2 videos on the side. You might be interested in one of them. I'm trying to upload as much content as possible, so you want to be subscribed to make sure that you catch all of it. So thanks so much for tuning in, guys, and I'll see you next time.